A man can lose his horse, his money, even his name out here, the old ranch cook used to say, but once the desert takes your shadow, it never gives it back. Caleb Mercer remembered those words the moment the first punch of dust rolled across the Arizona trail. The afternoon sun hung low and copper-red over the mesas, turning the whole valley the color of dried blood and rusted iron. His horse moved slow beneath him, tired from 30 miles of hard ground, its hooves crunching through gravel and cactus needles while heat shimmered above the earth like smoke from a dying fire. Caleb adjusted the old saddle carefully, his rough fingers brushing over the faded carving burned into the leather years ago. For Tommy. The letters were cracked now, worn by rain, wind, and too many lonely miles. He stared at them longer than he meant to. Then he heard shouting from inside the saloon ahead. Red Hollow sat quiet under the heat except for that noise. A narrow strip of buildings leaned against the desert like tired old men. Dust drifted across the empty street. Somewhere far off, a screen door slammed against wood. Caleb tied his horse outside the saloon and stepped in slowly. The smell hit first. Whiskey, sweat, smoke, and old pine boards soaked with 20 years of bad decisions. 3 men stood near the counter surrounding a young Apache boy no older than 14. The boy held a crate against his chest with both hands while one of the men laughed and shoved his shoulder hard enough to nearly send him to the floor. "Careful," Caleb said quietly. The room barely noticed him at first. The piano player stopped. One chair creaked somewhere in the back. The tallest man turned slowly, smiling without warmth beneath a dusty black hat. "Didn't know this town hired preachers," he muttered. Caleb ignored the insult and looked at the boy instead. The kid's face stayed still, but his hands tightened around the crate. Fear did that sometimes. Made people freeze instead of run. Caleb knew the feeling. "Let the boy leave," he said. The tall man stepped closer now, boots scraping wood. "Or what?" Caleb looked past him toward the swinging doors where sunlight spilled across the floorboards. He seemed tired more than angry. "Or someday you'll remember this moment and wish you'd walked away." A few men laughed softly, but the room felt wrong now. Heavy. Like thunder waiting beyond the mountains. The tall man glanced outside and noticed Caleb's horse tied beside the trough. A slow grin spread across his face. "That your gelding?" Caleb nodded once. "Fine saddle too," the man said. "Shame if somebody rode off with it." Caleb said nothing. The Apache boy slipped quietly toward the door while every eye stayed locked on the 2 men in the middle of the saloon. Then suddenly the laughter returned. Low. Mean. Boots shifted. Someone bumped Caleb's shoulder from behind. Another hand grabbed his coat. Minutes later, the sun burned directly into his eyes as he stumbled alone across open desert without his horse, without water, and without the old saddle carrying Tommy's name. Behind him, distant laughter disappeared into the wind while evening dust slowly began to rise across the horizon. The desert changes after sundown. During the day it burns a man alive slow enough for him to think about every mistake he ever made. But at night, it whispers. Caleb Mercer walked through that whisper with cracked lips and dust clinging to his skin like old ash. The last light of evening stretched long across the valley, turning every rock and cactus into black shadows against the red earth. Somewhere behind him, nearly 6 miles away by his guess, the lights of Red Hollow had already come alive. Laughter. Whiskey glasses. Men forgetting what they had done before the dust even settled outside town. Caleb kept walking anyway. One boot in front of the other. Slow. Careful. His throat felt dry enough to split open. He had crossed bad country before. Army trails in New Mexico. Winter cattle drives through Wyoming snow so cold it froze leather stiff overnight. But thirst was different. Thirst crawled into a man's head and stayed there. He started hearing things around the 2nd mile. First came the memory of Tommy laughing beside a creek 15 years ago. Then came the sound of horse bells somewhere behind him, faint and uneven. Caleb stopped and listened hard. Nothing. Just wind moving through dry brush. He looked down at his hands. Dust coated every line in his skin. Old hands. Tired hands. The kind that had buried too many people and kept riding anyway. The desert air cooled fast now. He could smell creosote after the heat finally broke, sharp and bitter on the wind. Coyotes called somewhere far across the flats. Caleb squinted toward the distant hills and saw lightning flickering silently beyond the mesas. Summer storm. Too far away to help him. He kept moving until his knees nearly gave out beside a stretch of black volcanic stone. There he sat heavily in the dirt, breathing through the ache in his chest while darkness slowly swallowed the trail behind him. His eyes drifted shut for only a second. Maybe less. But when he opened them again, he saw Tommy clearly. Not as a sick boy in bed the way memory usually brought him back. No. Tonight the boy stood beside the old ranch fence at 12 years old, grinning beneath a straw hat too big for his head. You said this saddle would last forever, Tommy had once told him. Caleb remembered tightening the straps while morning frost still clung to the grass. Good leather always outlives the rider, Caleb had answered. Back then, he believed it. Now the saddle was gone. Taken by strangers who would never understand why a tired old rancher would risk trouble over a carved name burned into cracked leather. Caleb lowered his head into his hands. For the first time since leaving town, fear finally reached him. Not fear of dying. Men like him made peace with that years ago. It was the thought of Tommy disappearing for good that hollowed him out inside. Then came the sound again. Hooves. Real this time. Slow. Measured. More than one horse moving through the dark. Caleb lifted his head carefully. Dust rolled low across the moonlit trail ahead. Shapes moved inside it. Silent shapes. Watching him. The riders stayed still at the edge of the dust like they had risen out of the earth itself. Moonlight slid across their horses and silver beads hanging from worn leather shirts. Caleb Mercer counted at least 8 shapes through the dark, maybe more hidden behind the drifting sand. None of them spoke. None of them moved. Only the slow breathing of horses filled the desert night. Caleb pushed himself upright against the black stone, though every muscle in his body felt heavy as wet rope. His vision blurred once, then steadied again. The rider in front stepped closer. Older than the others. Broad shoulders wrapped in a dark wool blanket faded by years of wind and sun. Gray streaks cut through his long black hair. Around his neck hung a string of carved bone pieces that clicked softly whenever the breeze touched them. The man studied Caleb without expression. Not anger. Not kindness either. Just patience. The kind old mountains carried. Caleb noticed something hanging from the saddle beside him. A worn leather saddle with cracked edges and faded stitching. His saddle. For Tommy. The letters caught pale moonlight. Caleb stared hard, almost afraid his mind had started lying to him. The Apache elder reached down slowly and lifted a canteen from his saddle horn. He tossed it gently through the dust. Caleb caught it with both hands. Cool water touched his lips a second later, and for one long moment the whole world seemed to stop moving. He drank carefully. Men who crossed deserts learned that lesson young. Too much water too fast could punish a body already dying of thirst. When he lowered the canteen, the old Apache was still watching him. Why? Caleb finally asked, his voice rough from dust. The elder tilted his head slightly, as though weighing whether the question deserved an answer. Then his eyes drifted toward the saddle again. A boy carried that saddle once, he said quietly. Caleb felt cold despite the desert heat still trapped in the rocks around him. The elder's English carried the slow rhythm of someone who chose every word carefully before releasing it into the air. 15 winters ago, the man continued, he crossed mountains with it. Caleb frowned. You knew my son. The elder did not answer immediately. Somewhere behind him, one of the younger Apache riders shifted in his saddle while another horse snorted softly into the night wind. The old man finally stepped down from his horse. Dust curled around his boots as he walked forward. And stopped only a few feet away. Close enough now for Caleb to see the deep lines weathered into his face. No, the elder said. But my son knew you. Silence settled heavy between them. Caleb searched the man's eyes, trying to pull old memories from years buried beneath cattle drives, funerals, and lonely trails. Then suddenly he remembered a winter near Fort Defiance. Snow blowing sideways through pine trees. A frightened Apache boy hiding behind a broken wagon while drunken soldiers searched the hills with lanterns. Caleb had given the boy food, a blanket, and his old saddle after the child's mule collapsed in the snow. The elder reached down and brushed his fingers lightly across the carved name burned into the leather. My son carried this for 3 days, he said. He said the white rancher who helped him had sad eyes. Caleb swallowed hard. What happened to the boy? The elder looked toward the dark horizon where more dust moved beneath the moonlight. His face remained calm, but something behind his eyes dimmed. Winter happened, he answered softly. Then he looked back at Caleb Mercer and said the words that made the desert suddenly feel very small. The men who took your horse tonight ride under the same badge that hunted my son. The old Apache called himself Nantan Gray Wolf, though he spoke the name so quietly the wind nearly carried it away before Caleb Mercer fully heard it. The riders led him through narrow stone passages hidden between dark cliffs where moonlight barely touched the ground. Their horses moved carefully over loose rock while the desert air turned colder with every mile. Caleb rode beneath a wool blanket one of the younger men handed him without a word. His body still ached from thirst and exhaustion, but something heavier sat on him now. Memory. It followed him through the canyon like another rider. Near midnight they reached a small Apache camp tucked deep beside a spring hidden among cottonwood trees. Firelight flickered softly against stone walls blackened by years of smoke. Women stirred iron pots over low flames while children slept beneath blankets close to the rocks. Nobody stared at Caleb openly, but he felt their eyes. All the same. Curious. Careful. One elderly woman stepped forward and handed him a bowl of warm stew with corn and rabbit meat. Caleb thanked her quietly before sitting near the fire. Nantan remained standing for a long while, watching sparks drift into the dark sky. Then finally the old Apache lowered himself across from Caleb and placed the saddle gently beside the flames. The carved letters glowed orange in the firelight. For Tommy. Nantan touched the leather once with weathered fingers. My son carried this through snow, he said. Caleb looked up slowly. What was his name? The old man stared into the fire before answering. Dakota. The name settled heavily between them. Caleb remembered the boy clearer now. Thin face. Torn coat. Eyes too old for a child. 15 winters earlier Caleb had been hauling supplies near Fort Defiance when he found the boy hiding beneath a broken wagon half buried in snow. Soldiers from the fort had been drinking hard after rumors of Apache raids farther south. Some wanted revenge against anyone they could find. The boy had said almost nothing, but fear followed him like smoke. Caleb remembered giving him coffee heated over a small campfire while snow fell thick through the pine trees. You should not help me, the boy had whispered back then. Caleb had shrugged while tightening the old saddle onto the mule he planned to trade in town. Maybe, he answered. But I am helping anyway. Nantan listened quietly while the fire cracked between them. Dakota told that story many times, he said softly. He said the white rancher looked lonelier than the winter mountains. Caleb lowered his eyes toward the flames. Your son made it home. Nantan nodded once, but sadness moved behind the gesture like a shadow passing over water. For a while. Wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves above them. Somewhere deeper in the canyon, a horse shifted against its tether rope. The old Apache reached into a leather pouch beside him and pulled out something wrapped carefully in cloth. He unfolded it slowly. Inside rested a silver sheriff badge darkened with age. Caleb stared at it immediately. A small crack cut across the star near the center. He recognized it before Nantan even spoke again. "The man in the black hat wears this symbol now," Nantan said. Caleb felt cold spread through his chest. The same badge. The same lawman who hunted Dakota through winter snow years ago. Nantan looked directly at him across the fire. "Tonight in Red Hollow," he said quietly, "when they stole from you, they did not know whose memory they touched." By sunrise, Red Hollow had already forgotten Caleb Mercer. That was the way frontier towns survived. Men buried guilt beneath whiskey before breakfast and called it law by supper. Dust rolled slowly through the main street while the morning heat climbed over the rooftops. Outside the saloon, Caleb's horse stood tied beside the trough with its head lowered against the flies. The old saddle was gone now. One of the men had taken it inside during the night after too many drinks and too much laughing. Inside the saloon, the smell of stale smoke and spilled whiskey clung to the air thick as wet cloth. The tall man in the black hat leaned back in his chair near the poker table, boots resting against another seat while sunlight pushed through the dirty windows behind him. His name was Wade Cutter, though most people in Arizona Territory simply called him Cutter because he had a habit of removing himself from trouble before trouble came looking for him. The silver badge pinned to his vest caught the light each time he moved. Cracked near the center. Old. Worn. Earned years ago under different rules. One of the younger deputies laughed while holding Caleb's saddle up for the room to see. "Imagine carrying this old thing across half the territory," he said. "Looks like it belongs in a graveyard." Another man pointed toward the carved name burned into the leather. "Tommy," he muttered. Must have meant something to him. Cutter reached for his whiskey glass slowly. "Everything means something to somebody," he replied. "That does not make it valuable." The room chuckled softly. Near the piano, the bartender wiped glasses without speaking. He had watched Caleb stand up for the Apache boy yesterday. Watched the whole thing happen. But towns like Red Hollow taught men early that silence cost less than courage. Outside, heat shimmered across the empty street while wagon wheels creaked somewhere beyond the general store. Then the saloon doors opened quietly. The same Apache boy from yesterday stepped inside carrying a sack of flour against his chest. Every conversation stopped. The boy kept his eyes lowered as he moved toward the counter. Cutter studied him over the rim of his glass. "You are either brave," he said calmly, "or very foolish." The boy said nothing. The bartender took the flour sack and handed over 2 coins quickly, clearly hoping the child would leave before trouble started breathing again. But before the boy reached the door, his eyes drifted toward Caleb's saddle resting across the poker table. He froze. Just for a second. Cutter noticed. Everybody noticed. The deputy holding the saddle grinned and lifted it higher. "Recognize this?" he asked. The boy stared at the carved letters. Something moved across his face then. Not fear. Not anger. Something older. Sadder. Cutter narrowed his eyes carefully. "You have seen this before." The boy finally looked up. "It belongs to a man who helped people," he answered quietly. The room laughed again, but weaker this time. Even Cutter did not smile fully. The Apache boy reached for the door. Before stepping outside, he paused and looked back once toward the men around the poker table. "Dust remembers things men forget," he said softly. Then he disappeared into the sunlight. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Outside, wind rolled down from the mesas carrying a low wall of distant dust across the horizon south of town. One rider at first glance. Maybe 2. Then more shapes slowly began to appear inside the rising haze. By late afternoon the heat over Red Hollow turned thick enough to bend the horizon. Dust drifted slowly through the empty street while townsfolk moved quieter than usual, speaking in lowered voices beneath porch roofs and faded awnings. Word traveled fast across frontier towns, especially when fear rode alongside it. Everybody had heard the Apache boys' warning by now. Dust remembers things men forget. Some laughed at it. Others kept glancing south toward the open desert. Every few minutes without realizing they were doing it. Inside the saloon, Wade Cutter sat near the front window with one hand resting beside his whiskey glass while the cracked silver badge gleamed against his dark vest. Caleb Mercer's saddle still lay across the poker table untouched since morning. Nobody seemed eager to joke about it anymore. One of the younger deputies finally broke the silence. "You really think the old rancher survived out there?" Cutter stared through the window toward the distant mesas. "The desert decides that," he answered calmly. "Not me." The deputy shifted uneasily. "And the Apache?" Cutter lifted the glass slowly but never drank from it. "Men like them do not ride 30 miles over one saddle." Outside, wind rolled harder now. Shopkeepers began pulling hanging signs tighter against their buildings while horses tied along the trough stamped nervously at the ground. Even the stray dogs disappeared beneath porches. Then somebody near the barber shop froze. A woman carrying groceries stopped walking. Far down the southern trail, dust had begun rising again. Thick. Wide. Moving steady toward town. At first it looked like another summer storm crossing the flats. But storms did not move in straight lines. The bartender stepped outside the saloon wiping his hands nervously against his apron. More people gathered silently along the wooden sidewalks. No one spoke above a whisper. Shapes slowly appeared inside the dust cloud. Riders. More than 10. Then more behind them. 20 maybe. The sound reached town next. Hooves striking dry earth in slow rhythm. Not charging. Not rushing. Just coming. Cutter finally stood from his chair and walked outside beneath the fading evening light. The deputy beside him rested a hand near his revolver. Cutter lowered it gently with one look. "Not today," he muttered. The riders entered town without a single word. Apache men wearing dark blankets and worn leather moved through the dust like shadows crossing water. Their horses stayed calm despite the tension hanging over the street. Nobody among them carried rifles in hand. Nobody shouted threats. That silence frightened Red Hollow more than anger ever could. Then the crowd noticed the rider at the center. Caleb Mercer. Alive. He rode slowly beneath the orange light of sunset wearing the same weathered coat from the day before. Dust covered his boots and shoulders, but his back stayed straight in the saddle. In his hands rested the old leather saddle carved with Tommy's name. The entire street seemed to stop breathing. Cutter narrowed his eyes carefully as Caleb guided his horse forward through the center of town. Behind him rode Nantan Gray Wolf with calm eyes fixed ahead, the cracked sheriff badge hanging from his saddle horn where everyone could see it. The old Apache never looked left or right. He simply rode beside Caleb through the silence while 30 mounted Apache riders filled the street behind them like a wall built from dust and memory. Caleb finally stopped his horse outside the saloon doors. He looked at Cutter for a long moment without hatred in his face. Somehow that made the moment heavier. Then Caleb stepped down slowly, lifted the saddle into his arms, and walked toward the saloon while every person in Red Hollow watched the dust follow behind him into the fading light. The saloon doors swung inward slowly beneath Caleb Mercer's hands, and every sound inside seemed to shrink away from him. Poker chips stopped clicking. Whiskey glasses froze halfway to mouths. Even the piano player near the corner lowered his hands from the keys without realizing it. Evening light poured through the dusty windows in long gold streaks while desert wind carried fine sand across the floorboards behind Caleb's boots. He walked calmly toward the poker table with the old saddle resting heavy in his arms. Wade Cutter stood near the bar now, one hand hanging near his belt, though he had not touched the revolver once since the Apache riders entered town. Outside, 30 mounted Apache men waited in complete silence beneath the fading sky. Their horses shifted softly in the dust, but none of the riders spoke. Red Hollow had never heard quiet like that before. Caleb stopped beside the poker table where the deputies had mocked Tommy's name only hours earlier. Slowly, carefully, he placed the saddle onto the worn wood. The sound of old leather touching the table seemed louder than thunder in the still room. Cutter watched him closely. "Looks like the desert changed its mind about you," he muttered. Caleb looked down at the carved letters burned into the leather. "For Tommy." His fingers brushed the faded marks once before he answered. "No," he said quietly. "The desert remembered something you forgot." Nobody moved. Sweat rolled slowly down one deputy's face near the staircase while another kept glancing nervously toward the windows where Apache riders remained visible through drifting dust outside. Cutter lifted his chin slightly. "You came back with an army over a saddle?" Caleb shook his head once. "Not over a saddle." That answer settled heavily through the room. Cutter's eyes narrowed carefully as if he finally understood there was something larger standing inside the saloon than wounded pride or stolen property. Caleb turned slightly then and looked toward the bartender. "You remember Dakota?" he asked. The bartender froze with a rag still hanging from his hand. Older memories moved behind his eyes now. Winter stories. Soldiers riding drunk through snow. Apache families disappearing into mountains. He swallowed slowly. "I remember the name," he admitted. Cutter's jaw tightened. "That was years ago." Caleb nodded. 15 winters. Wind rattled the windows softly. Outside, somewhere down the street, a horse snorted into the evening air. Caleb rested both hands on the saddle now like a man standing beside a grave. A scared Apache boy crossed the mountains carrying this leather because somebody wearing your badge hunted him through the snow. Cutter glanced toward the cracked silver badge pinned against his vest. The room felt smaller suddenly. Hotter. One deputy shifted uneasily and whispered, "Wade." Cutter silenced him with a look. Then Nantan Gray Wolf appeared silently in the doorway behind Caleb. The old Apache did not step fully inside. He simply stood beneath the fading sunset with calm eyes watching the room. Dust moved around his boots while the bone pieces hanging from his neck clicked softly in the wind. Nobody reached for a weapon. Nobody dared. Nantan slowly removed the cracked sheriff badge from his saddle horn and placed it onto a nearby table beside the whiskey bottles. The metal star spun once before lying still. "My son died carrying kindness from a stranger," Nantan said quietly. That badge followed him into the mountains. Cutter stared at the old badge without speaking. For the first time since Caleb returned, uncertainty crossed his face. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. Shame trying to remember its own name. Caleb looked at Cutter a long moment before speaking again. "You stole the wrong thing yesterday." Cutter finally lifted his eyes. "And what was that?" Caleb glanced down toward Tommy's name carved into the saddle. A memory that still belonged to the dead. No man inside the saloon touched a drink after Caleb Mercer spoke those words. The desert wind kept sliding through the swinging doors behind Nantan Gray Wolf, carrying dust across the floorboards in thin restless lines. Outside, Apache riders remained motionless beneath the deepening evening sky while lanterns slowly flickered alive along the street of Red Hollow. The whole town felt suspended between heartbeats. Wade Cutter stared at the old saddle resting on the poker table as though the carved name burned into the leather had suddenly become heavier than iron. For Tommy. He looked older now than he had an hour earlier. Smaller too. One of the deputies near the staircase cleared his throat nervously. "Wade," he whispered, "maybe we should just give the rancher his horse and let this pass." Cutter did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the cracked sheriff badge lying beside the whiskey bottles. 15 winters earlier that badge had meant something different. Law. Order. Respect. Now it looked like nothing more than tired metal carrying too many ghosts. Caleb watched him quietly. "You remember that winter," Caleb said. Cutter finally nodded once. Slow. Reluctant. "I remember rumors," he muttered. "Apache raids. Missing cattle. Settlers disappearing." Nantan spoke from the doorway without raising his voice. "And frightened men turning every child into an enemy." Silence followed again. Nobody argued with him. Not even Cutter. The bartender lowered his eyes toward the counter while townsfolk standing outside the windows listened without speaking. Some remembered those winters too. Fear had ruled Arizona territory back then. Fear and stories told by men holding rifles beside campfires. Cutter rubbed a tired hand across his jaw. "That boy was not supposed to survive out there," he admitted quietly. Nantan nodded once. "But he did." The old Apache stepped farther into the saloon now. Firelight from the lanterns touched the deep lines in his weathered face while the bone pieces around his neck clicked softly against one another. He survived because a grieving rancher saw a child instead of a tribe. Caleb lowered his eyes briefly after hearing that. He had never spoken much about Tommy after the fever took him. Some grief stayed buried because men feared what might happen if they dug too deep. Cutter looked toward Caleb carefully. "You never told anybody." Caleb shrugged faintly. "It was not a story worth telling." Nantan's gaze shifted toward the saddle. "It was worth remembering." Outside, thunder rolled far beyond the mesas though the sky above town remained clear. One deputy slowly removed his hand from near his revolver and stepped back from the poker table. Then another did the same. Something inside Red Hollow had started changing, quiet as dusk settling over the desert. The townspeople watching through the windows no longer looked at the Apache riders with fear alone. They looked at them with uncertainty. Reflection. Maybe even shame. Cutter noticed it too. His shoulders sagged slightly beneath the weight of every eye in the room. Caleb finally reached down and lifted the saddle into his arms again. "I did not come back here for revenge," he said calmly. Cutter frowned. "Then why come back at all?" Caleb looked around the saloon slowly. At the bartender who stayed silent yesterday. At the deputies who laughed while a thirsty man walked into the desert alone. At the townsfolk outside pretending they had seen nothing. "Because people forget too easy," Caleb answered. "And forgetting is how decent men become cruel without noticing." Nobody spoke after that. The old clock behind the bar ticked softly while dust moved beneath the lantern light. Then Nantan Gray Wolf stepped beside Caleb Mercer and placed one weathered hand gently against the old saddle carrying Tommy's name. "My son carried this through winter snow," he said quietly. "Tonight, your son carried it back through men's hearts." Morning arrived softly over Red Hollow, the way mercy sometimes comes to stubborn places long after it should have. Pale sunlight spilled across the empty street while cool wind moved through the town carrying the smell of dust, horses, and distant rain somewhere beyond the mesas. The saloon doors stood open now, swaying gently against their hinges after a sleepless night. Nobody inside Red Hollow had celebrated much after Caleb Mercer and the Apache riders left the evening before. The whiskey tasted different once men were forced to look directly at themselves. Outside the stable, Caleb tightened the straps beneath his horse carefully while the old saddle rested where it belonged once again. For Tommy. The worn letters caught the early morning light. Nearby, Nantan Gray Wolf waited beside his horse in silence, watching the sunrise spread gold across the canyon walls far beyond town. The old Apache looked tired now that the night was over. Not weak. Just old in the honest way mountains become old. Around them, Apache riders prepared quietly for the trail south. No songs. No victory. Only the sound of leather tightening, horses breathing, and boots moving through dust. Caleb rested one hand against the saddle for a moment longer before climbing up slowly. Across the street, townspeople had begun gathering beneath storefront awnings to watch. Some lowered their eyes when Caleb looked their way. Others nodded faintly, unsure whether they deserved forgiveness from a man they abandoned to the desert only yesterday. The bartender stepped forward first holding a small cloth bundle in both hands. He stopped beside Caleb's horse and offered it upward quietly. "Food for the trail," he muttered. Caleb accepted it with a nod. "Thank you." The bartender hesitated before speaking again. "I should have said something yesterday." Caleb looked at him calmly beneath the morning sun. "Most men think silence keeps them safe," he answered. "Sometimes it just keeps them silent." The bartender lowered his eyes after that. Near the saloon porch, Wade Cutter stood alone beneath the faded signboard. The cracked silver badge was gone from his vest now. Without it, he looked less like a lawman and more like what he truly was. Just another tired man standing in the dust with too many years behind him. Caleb studied him for a long second before guiding his horse closer. Cutter cleared his throat roughly. "I never knew the boy survived that winter," he admitted quietly. Nantan turned his horse slightly beside Caleb. "He survived long enough to remember kindness," the old Apache replied. Cutter nodded once, though the answer seemed to wound him more deeply than anger would have. Caleb reached into his coat pocket then and pulled out a single silver dollar worn smooth with age. Without speaking, he tossed it gently onto the saloon porch at Cutter's feet. The coin spun once in the morning light before settling beside the wooden steps. "What is that for?" Cutter asked. Caleb looked toward the open desert beyond town. "For the drink you never offered." Then he rode away. The Apache riders followed him silently through the street while townspeople watched from porches and windows without daring to interrupt the moment. Dust rose beneath the horses and drifted slowly behind them as they moved south toward the mesas glowing red beneath the sunrise. Nantan Gray Wolf rode beside Caleb Mercer for nearly a mile before either man spoke again. Finally the old Apache glanced toward the worn saddle carrying Tommy's name and said quietly, "Your son still rides with you." Caleb stared ahead toward the open desert where morning light stretched endless across the land. After a long silence, he answered in a voice almost carried away by the wind. "Maybe that is why I never truly rode alone." Behind them, Red Hollow disappeared slowly into dust while the silver dollar remained untouched on the saloon porch long after the riders were gone.